The security guard's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my face as I sat in the driver's seat of my 15-year-old Honda Civic, trying to shield my sleeping son from the harsh light. "Ma'am, you can't stay here overnight. This is private property." I blinked against the glare, my neck stiff from another night spent sleeping upright in a car that had become our only shelter. Tommy stirred in the passenger seat, his medication-induced sleep interrupted by the commotion, and I felt the familiar surge of panic that accompanied any disruption to his fragile routine. "Please," I whispered, glancing at the digital clock that read 2:47 a.m. "My son is sick. We just need a few more hours." The security guard's expression softened slightly as he took in Tommy's pale face, the medical bracelet on his thin wrist, the prescription bottles organized in the center console like a mobile pharmacy. At 14, my son looked younger, the neurological condition that required constant medication having stunted his growth and left him dependent on treatments we could no longer afford. "Look, lady, I'm sorry about your situation, but I've got my orders. The shopping center's been having problems with people camping out here, and management is cracking down." I nodded, understanding that his kindness had limits defined by his paycheck. "Could you give us 20 minutes? Just to let him wake up slowly? Sudden movements sometimes trigger his seizures." The guard hesitated, his flashlight beam wavering. 20 minutes, but then you need to move along." As his footsteps faded across the empty parking lot, I leaned my head against the steering wheel and tried to calculate how much gas we had left, where we could go next, whether the bottle of Tommy's anti-seizure medication would last until I could scrape together money for the next refill. 3 years ago, I had been Sarah Mitchell, head nurse at Mitchell General Hospital, the medical facility my family had owned for 4 generations. I had been respected in my profession, financially stable, living in the house where I'd grown up with Tommy in his own room, his medical needs managed by the best specialists money could buy. Now I was Sarah Mitchell, former nurse whose license had been revoked after being accused of stealing narcotics. Sarah Mitchell, the sister who'd been cut out of the family business and left to watch from the outside as her brothers sold the hospital for $50 million. Sarah Mitchell, homeless mother living in her car with a sick child, working whatever jobs would hire someone with her record. "Mom?" Tommy's voice was groggy, confused. "Are we moving again?" "Just adjusting our parking spot, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Tommy was already reaching for his inhaler, the stress of being awakened triggering the respiratory issues that accompanied his condition. I helped him with the medication, counting the remaining doses and trying not to think about what would happen when this inhaler ran out like the others. "I'm thirsty," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. I handed him the water bottle from my purse, watching him drink carefully, rationing each sip like the precious resource it had become. The days when Tommy could drink as much water as he wanted, eat whatever food appealed to him, take medication without me calculating the cost per pill, those days felt like someone else's life. "Mom, tell me about the hospital again, about when we lived in the house." Tommy had been 11 when everything collapsed, old enough to remember our old life, but young enough to need the comfort of familiar stories. I'd told him about Mitchell General Hospital so many times that the memories had become worn smooth like stones in a river, comforting in their repetition. "Your great-great-grandfather built that hospital in 1923, I began, starting the car and driving slowly out of the shopping center parking lot. He wanted to make sure people in our town had access to good medical care, no matter how much money they had. And we lived in the big house with the blue shutters. That's right. You had your own room with the space-themed wallpaper you picked out yourself. And there was a garden where you used to help me plant tomatoes every spring." I didn't tell him about the nights when I walked past our old house, now owned by strangers, and saw lights in the windows of rooms where we used to live. I didn't tell him about watching Marcus and David drive past in their new luxury cars, funded by the hospital sale that should have included my share. I didn't tell him about the medical bills that continued to arrive for his treatments, bills that my brothers could have covered with pocket change from their windfall. Why did Uncle Marcus and Uncle David say you stole medicine? It was the question Tommy asked most often, the one I still couldn't answer without feeling the weight of betrayal settle in my chest like a stone. Sometimes people make mistakes about what they think they saw. Sometimes they believe things that aren't true. But you never stole anything. No, sweetheart, I never stole anything. What I didn't tell my 14-year-old son was that his uncles hadn't made a mistake. They had deliberately, systematically destroyed my reputation and my livelihood to eliminate me from the hospital sale. They had planted evidence, bribed witnesses, and manipulated medical records to make it appear that I had been stealing morphine to sell on the street. The irony was that I had been the one pushing for the family business to stay in the family, arguing against the sale that Marcus and David wanted so desperately. If they had simply outvoted me, they could have proceeded legally. Instead, they had chosen to frame me for crimes I didn't commit, ensuring that I would be too busy defending myself to interfere with their plans. I found another parking lot, this one behind a 24-hour diner where the overnight manager usually didn't bother people who looked like they belonged. Tommy fell asleep again quickly, his medication making him drowsy, and I sat watching the empty highway and thinking about the path that had led us here. The pharmaceutical theft charges had been dropped for lack of evidence, but the nursing board had been less forgiving. The mere accusation of drug diversion was enough to trigger an investigation that destroyed my career even without a conviction. Hospitals wouldn't hire me, medical temp agencies wouldn't represent me, and the nursing license that had taken years to earn was revoked permanently. Meanwhile, Marcus and David had sold Mitchell General to a corporate healthcare chain, pocketed $25 million each, and moved into mansions on the other side of town. They sent Christmas cards to Tommy, generic cards with $20 bills tucked inside, as if their token gestures could compensate for destroying his mother's life. My phone buzzed with a text message from Janet, the manager at the truck stop where I worked the overnight shift cleaning bathrooms and restocking supplies. "Sarah, need you to come in early tonight if possible." Maria called out sick. Extra hours meant extra money, which meant I could buy Tommy's medication without having to choose between pills and gas money. I texted back confirmation and settled in to wait for dawn, when I could drop Tommy at the public library, where he spent his days while I worked. The library had become Tommy's school, his social club, his refuge from a life that had become too complicated for a 14-year-old to fully understand. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had taken him under her wing, helping him with online courses and pretending not to notice when he stayed past closing time because he had nowhere else to go. As the sun began to rise over the highway, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of better mornings in a different life, I thought about the choices that had brought us here and the choices that lay ahead. I had been naive enough to believe that family meant loyalty, that shared blood created unbreakable bonds, that people who had known you your entire life couldn't look you in the eye and destroy everything you'd worked for. I had learned that some betrayals were so complete, so carefully planned, that they left no room for forgiveness or reconciliation. But I had also learned that you could survive the loss of everything you thought defined you, your career, your home, your family's respect, and still wake up every morning determined to protect the one person who mattered most. Some lessons were more expensive than others, and some victories took longer to achieve than anyone expected. But sitting in my car at dawn, watching Tommy sleep peacefully despite everything we'd lost, I knew that survival itself was a form of success that my brothers would never understand. They had won the hospital sale and lost their sister. I had lost everything except the only thing that truly mattered. Some trades, I was beginning to understand, were better than they appeared. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like every other morning for the past 3 years, with me calculating how many hours I could work before Tommy's medication schedule required my attention, and how much money we needed to survive another week. I was sitting in the truck stop break room, eating a convenience store sandwich and reviewing Tommy's medical appointment calendar on my phone, when Janet knocked on the doorframe with an expression I'd never seen before. "Sarah, there's a man here to see you. Says he's a lawyer." She paused, her weathered face creased with concern. "He's wearing a suit that probably costs more than my car." My stomach dropped immediately to somewhere near my shoes. Lawyers meant trouble, and in my experience, trouble came with bills attached. Maybe Marcus and David had decided that destroying my career wasn't enough. Maybe they wanted to pursue criminal charges, or sue me for defamation, or find some other legal avenue to make my life even more difficult. Did he say what he wants? Just that he needs to speak with Sarah Mitchell about an urgent legal matter. Janet studied my face. "Sarah, you're white as a sheet. Do you need me to call someone?" "No, it's fine. Could you ask him to wait? I'll be out in a minute. I used those 60 seconds to splash water on my face, straighten my uniform shirt, and remind myself that whatever this lawyer wanted, it couldn't make our situation much worse than it already was. We were already homeless, already broke, already living on the margins of society. Rock bottom, I'd learned, had its advantages. There wasn't much farther to fall. The lawyer was exactly as Janet had described. Expensive suit, polished shoes, briefcase that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But his expression was kind rather than predatory, and he stood when I entered the truck stop lobby as if I were someone worthy of respect rather than a broke former nurse in a stained uniform. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jonathan Hayes from Hayes, Williams & Associates. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I have to warn you, Mr. Hayes, if you're here about money owed to someone, you're going to be disappointed. I don't have any assets worth pursuing. He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Ms. Mitchell, I'm not here to collect anything from you. I'm here because my client, Robert Wellington III, recently passed away, and he left specific instructions regarding you in his will. Robert Wellington III. The name was familiar in the way that wealthy people's names are familiar. You see them in newspaper business sections, on hospital wings, attached to charitable foundations. But I couldn't place any personal connection to someone of his stature. I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. I don't know any Robert Wellington. Actually, you do. 10 years ago, you were the head nurse at Mitchell General Hospital when Mr. Wellington was brought to the emergency room in cardiac arrest. According to his medical records, you worked for 18 consecutive hours to stabilize him, refusing to leave his bedside even when other medical staff suggested the case was hopeless. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Robert Wellington, not the billionaire, just the 73-year-old man whose heart had stopped beating in the ambulance, whose family had gathered in the waiting room, expecting to plan a funeral instead of a recovery. I remembered the marathon medical battle, the delicate balance of medications, the moment when his vital signs finally stabilized after what felt like an eternity of uncertainty. I remember him, but Mr. Hayes, I was just doing my job. Any nurse would have, according to Mr. Wellington's personal notes, any nurse would not have done what you did. Most would have followed protocol and prepared the family for the worst. You went beyond protocol, beyond standard care, beyond what anyone expected or required. I thought about that night, about the decision to ignore the statistics that suggested Robert Wellington was too far gone to save, about the 18 hours I'd spent adjusting medications and monitoring vitals because something told me he could still be pulled back from the edge. Mr. Wellington never forgot what you did for him, Jonathan Hayes continued. He spent the last 10 years of his life in good health because of your dedication that night. And Ms. Mitchell, he spent some of that time investigating what happened to you after he learned about your situation. My situation? The pharmaceutical theft allegations, the loss of your nursing license, your brother's acquisition of the hospital sale proceeds. His voice was careful, professional. Mr. Wellington had considerable resources at his disposal, and he used those resources to conduct a very thorough investigation into the events that destroyed your career. I felt the world shift slightly, like standing on a boat deck when an unexpected wave rocks the hull. Someone with resources, real resources, had been investigating Marcus and David's conspiracy. Someone had been looking into the lies that had cost me everything. What kind of investigation? The kind that uncovers financial records, phone conversations, email exchanges, and witness statements that paint a very different picture of events than the one presented to the nursing board. Jonathan Hayes reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. Mr. Wellington documented everything, Ms. Mitchell. Everything. Why? Why would a stranger spend time and money investigating something that didn't affect him? Because you saved his life. Because he believed in justice. And because, according to his personal letters, he recognized in you the kind of character that deserved protection rather than persecution. Jonathan Hayes placed the folder on the table between us, his expression growing more serious. Ms. Mitchell, I need to inform you that Mr. Wellington passed away 3 weeks ago from complications related to pneumonia. His funeral was attended by business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists from around the world. But before he died, he made arrangements that will change your life significantly. What kind of arrangements? Mr. Wellington was one of the wealthiest men in the country. His business empire included real estate developments, technology companies, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and healthcare services. The total value of his estate is estimated at approximately $2.8 billion. I stared at him, trying to process numbers that felt abstract, meaningless in the context of my truck stop, break room, and convenience store sandwich. Mr. Hayes, why are you telling me this? Because Mr. Wellington left his entire estate to you, Ms. Mitchell. All of it. The businesses, the properties, the investment portfolios, the liquid assets, everything. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. I looked around the truck stop break room, the vending machines, the time clock where I punched in for my overnight shifts, the bulletin board covered with notices about healthcare benefits I couldn't afford, and tried to understand how this conversation was happening in this place. That's not possible. It's very possible. And it's already been processed through probate court. The estate transfer is complete, pending your acceptance of the inheritance terms. Inheritance terms? Jonathan Hayes opened the folder and withdrew a letter written in careful handwriting on expensive stationery. Mr. Wellington left this for you personally. But Ms. Mitchell, before you read it, I need you to understand that accepting this inheritance comes with certain obligations. What kind of obligations? The obligation to use the evidence Mr. Wellington gathered to seek justice for what was done to you. The obligation to ensure that people who commit the kind of fraud your brothers committed face the consequences of their actions. I thought about Marcus and David, about their mansions and luxury cars and comfortable lives built on the foundation of my destroyed reputation. I thought about Tommy sleeping in the passenger seat of our car, about the medication bottles I counted like a miser counts coins, about the 3 years of poverty and humiliation that had followed their betrayal. Mr. Hayes, what exactly did Mr. Wellington's investigation uncover? Evidence of criminal conspiracy, fraud, witness tampering, and evidence fabrication. Enough to support federal charges against both of your brothers. He paused, studying my expression. Enough to clear your name completely and restore your nursing license. And if I accept the inheritance? Then you become one of the wealthiest women in America, and you gain access to the legal resources necessary to ensure that justice is finally served. I looked at the letter in my hands, at the handwriting of a man who'd remembered a debt of gratitude for 10 years, who'd spent his final decade investigating an injustice against someone who'd saved his life. Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you something. Of course. Is this real? Or am I having some kind of breakdown in a truck stop break room? He smiled again, the expression warm and understanding. Ms. Mitchell, this is absolutely real. And Ms. Mitchell? Yes, your troubles are over. All of them. I opened Robert Wellington's letter with shaking hands, knowing that the words inside would either change everything or prove that miracles didn't happen to people like me. Some gifts, I was about to learn, came with instructions, and some instructions were worth waiting a lifetime to receive. Robert Wellington's letter was written in the careful script of someone who knew his words would outlive him. Each sentence crafted with the precision of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people and billions of dollars. My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, then I have passed away, and my attorney has found you to deliver news that will sound impossible, but is absolutely true. You are now one of the wealthiest women in America, inheriting an empire built over 5 decades of business success. You will ask yourself why a stranger would leave you such a fortune. The answer is simple. You are not a stranger to me. You are the woman who refused to let me die when everyone else had given up. 10 years ago, I came to your hospital expecting to die. My heart had stopped, my family was preparing for a funeral, and the medical team was following protocol for end-of-life care. You ignored protocol. You ignored statistics. You ignored the advice of colleagues and supervisors who told you that some battles cannot be won. For 18 hours, you fought for my life with the determination of someone who understood that every person deserves extraordinary effort, not just ordinary care. You saved me not because I was wealthy or important, but because you believed saving lives was your calling. I lived 10 more years because of your dedication. I saw my grandchildren graduate college, walked my daughter down the aisle at her second wedding, built schools in underserved communities, and experienced joys I would have missed if you had followed standard medical procedure. Those 10 years were a gift from you to me. This inheritance is my gift to you in return. But Sarah, this inheritance comes with knowledge that will be difficult to bear, and obligations that will require courage you may not know you possess. I know what your brothers did to you. I know how they destroyed your career, stole your inheritance, and left you homeless with a sick child. I know because I spent considerable resources investigating every detail of their conspiracy. The evidence I have gathered is thorough, damning, and legally actionable. Your brothers committed multiple felonies in their effort to eliminate you from the hospital sale. They forged documents, bribed witnesses, planted evidence, and perjured themselves in legal proceedings. Most importantly, they destroyed the life of a woman who had dedicated herself to saving others simply because they wanted more money for themselves. This cannot stand. With this inheritance, you gain access to the finest legal team in the country, unlimited resources to pursue justice, and evidence that will ensure your brothers face the full consequences of their crimes. You may choose mercy over justice. You may decide that rebuilding your life is more important than destroying theirs. But Sarah, I ask you to remember that your brother's victims include not just you and your son, but every patient who might have been treated by a nurse they drove from the profession. Justice delayed is justice denied. Justice ignored becomes injustice perpetuated. Use this inheritance to build the life you and your son deserve. But also use it to ensure that people who commit the crimes your brothers committed understand that wealth and family connections cannot protect them from consequences. The legal files are extensive, detailed, and unassailable. Your attorney will explain the criminal charges that can be filed, the civil lawsuits that can be pursued, and the timeline for ensuring that your brothers spend the next decade defending themselves in court rather than enjoying their ill-gotten wealth. Sarah, you saved my life when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose by refusing to give up. Now I ask you to save your own life by refusing to let injustice stand unchallenged. With deepest gratitude and respect, Robert Wellington III. P.S. Your son Tommy's medical needs can now be addressed by the finest specialists in the world. The Children's Hospital in your new foundation portfolio includes a world-renowned neurological treatment center. Tommy will receive the care he needs, and you will never again have to choose between his medication and your next meal. Some debts can only be repaid by paying them forward. Make sure the world is a more just place than the one you inherited. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality more concrete and more surreal. 3 years of living in poverty, of rationing Tommy's medication, of working overnight shifts at truck stops for minimum wage, all of it ending with a handwritten note from a dead billionaire who'd remembered a debt of gratitude for a decade. Jonathan Hayes watched me process the information with the patience of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. When I finally looked up from the letter, he was ready with documents, explanations, and the practical details of inheriting a business empire. Ms. Mitchell, we need to discuss immediate steps. First, housing for you and your son. There's a penthouse apartment in downtown that belonged to Mr. Wellington, fully furnished, secure, available immediately. Second, medical care for Tommy. I can have appointments scheduled with pediatric neurologists by the end of the week. This is really happening. This is absolutely happening. But Ms. Mitchell, there are decisions you need to make about the criminal investigation. The evidence against your brothers is substantial, but pursuing charges will be emotionally difficult and publicly messy. I thought about Marcus and David, about the way they'd looked at me during the nursing board hearing, not with guilt or regret, but with cold calculation, as if I were a business problem they'd successfully solved. I thought about the Christmas cards they'd sent Tommy, $20 bills tucked inside generic holiday messages, their token gestures of maintaining family contact while enjoying the millions they'd stolen. Mr. Hayes, what exactly did the investigation uncover? Recorded phone conversations between your brothers, discussing how to frame you for drug theft, bank records showing payments to hospital employees who provided false testimony, email exchanges detailing their plan to eliminate you from the hospital sale, document analysis proving that evidence was planted in your personal belongings. They recorded their own conversations? Your brother Marcus apparently kept detailed records of the conspiracy, thinking documentation would protect him if David ever tried to implicate him in wrongdoing. He never imagined that someone with Mr. Wellington's resources would gain access to those records. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but the recognition that justice had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. If I pursue charges, what happens to them? Federal fraud charges carry sentences of 10 to 20 years. Conspiracy charges add additional time. Asset forfeiture procedures would seize their homes, cars, bank accounts, everything purchased with proceeds from the hospital sale. They would lose everything they gained by destroying you. And if I don't pursue charges, then they continue living in their mansions, enjoying their wealth, and believing that destroying their sister's life was a successful business strategy. I thought about Tommy, about the years he'd spent sleeping in cars and public libraries because his uncles had valued money more than family. I thought about the medication we'd rationed, the doctor's appointments we'd skipped, the specialists we couldn't afford to consult about his condition. Mr. Hayes, I need to see my son. I need to tell him that everything's going to be different now. Of course, but Ms. Mitchell, the media will learn about this inheritance within hours. Mr. Wellington's estate was significant enough that business reporters monitor probate filings. Your story, homeless former nurse inherits billions, will be front-page news, which means Marcus and David will find out too. They'll find out, and they'll likely attempt to contact you. They may claim innocence, offer apologies, or suggest that family reconciliation is more important than legal proceedings. I thought about my brother's capacity for manipulation, their talent for making their victims feel guilty for the damage they'd caused. 3 years ago, I'd been vulnerable to their gaslighting, too shocked by their betrayal to think clearly about revenge or justice. Now I was no longer vulnerable. Now I had resources they couldn't match and evidence they couldn't refute. Mr. Hayes, I want to pursue every possible criminal charge against both of my brothers. I want them to experience the same fear, uncertainty, and financial devastation they imposed on me and my son. I'll contact the federal prosecutor this afternoon. And Mr. Hayes, I want them to find out about the charges the same way I found out about losing everything, suddenly, publicly, and without warning. Consider it done, Ms. Mitchell. As I walked back to the truck stop parking lot to wake Tommy and tell him we were going home, to a real home with his own room and unlimited medication and access to the best doctors in the world, I thought about the strange mathematics of justice. For 3 years, I'd believed that good people sometimes suffered while bad people prospered. Now I understood that sometimes justice was just waiting for the right person to deliver it. Some debts apparently were repaid with interest, and some inheritances came with obligations that turned out to be privileges. Tommy's reaction to the news was typically 14-year-old practical, cutting through the surreal magnitude of our situation with questions that reminded me why he'd always been my anchor to reality. So we don't have to sleep in the car anymore? Never again. And I can have my medication without you counting the pills first? All the medication you need from the best doctors in the country. And Uncle Marcus and Uncle David are going to jail? I paused at that question, studying my son's face as we sat in the parking lot of our old life, the truck stop where I'd worked the overnight shift just hours before learning I was worth nearly $3 billion. Probably, yes, if the evidence is as strong as Mr. Hayes believes it is. Tommy nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned early that adults sometimes made terrible choices that hurt people they were supposed to protect. At 14, he understood betrayal better than most people twice his age. Good, he said simply. They hurt us on purpose. People who hurt people on purpose should have consequences. Out of the mouths of babes. Tommy had distilled the moral complexity of my situation into terms that made perfect sense. People who hurt people on purpose should have consequences. The penthouse apartment that Jonathan Hayes had mentioned turned out to be 40 floors above the city where I'd once worked as a respected nurse, where I'd later been publicly destroyed as an accused thief. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like traveling through layers of my own life, past the level where I'd lived in middle-class comfort, past the level where I'd fallen into poverty, up to heights I'd never imagined reaching. Tommy pressed his face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city spread below us like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. Mom, is this really ours? This is really ours. The apartment was furnished with the kind of understated luxury that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Comfortable furniture that had clearly been chosen for quality rather than flash. Artwork that looked original but not ostentatious. A kitchen stocked with food that didn't come from convenience stores. But the most remarkable feature of our new home wasn't the marble countertops or the designer furniture. It was Tommy's room. a space clearly designed for a teenage boy, complete with a computer, gaming system, and bookshelves filled with novels about adventure and discovery. Robert Wellington had planned for Tommy's comfort with the thoroughness of someone who understood that saving a mother's life meant caring for her child as well. "There's something else," I told Tommy as he explored his new room. "Mr. Hayes has arranged for you to see a neurologist next week. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto at Children's Medical Center. She's supposed to be one of the best pediatric neurologists in the country." Tommy turned from the window where he'd been watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and possibility. "Will she be able to help with the seizures?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to find out. And Tommy? Whatever she recommends, whatever treatments might help, we can afford them now. All of them." That night, I tucked my son into a real bed in his own room for the first time in 3 years, listening to him breathe normally without the stress-induced wheezing that had become constant during our homeless months. When he was asleep, I walked through our new apartment and tried to process the magnitude of what had changed in a single day. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Marcus's number appeared on the screen, and I realized that news of my inheritance had reached my brothers faster than Jonathan Hayes had predicted. "Sarah, thank God you answered. I just saw the news about Robert Wellington's will. Honey, we need to talk." The endearment hit me like a physical blow. Honey, as if 3 years of silence and abandonment could be erased with a single word, as if the brother who'd destroyed my life could reclaim the right to use terms of affection. "Hello, Marcus." "Sarah, this is incredible news. I mean, $2.8 billion? I can't even process numbers that large. You must be in complete shock." "I'm processing it." "I bet you are. Listen, honey, David and I want to take you to dinner tomorrow night. We need to celebrate this amazing turn of fortune. And we need to talk about the past, about misunderstandings and family relationships and moving forward together." Misunderstandings. As if systematic fraud and evidence planting were simple communication failures that could be resolved over appetizers and wine. "Marcus, I'm not available for dinner tomorrow." "Oh, of course, you're probably swamped with lawyers and financial advisors. What about this weekend? Or next week? Sarah, this inheritance changes everything for our family. We can finally put the past behind us and focus on the future." "What past are you referring to, Marcus?" A pause, careful calculation. The sound of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation but hadn't expected direct questions. "You know what I mean, honey. The hospital situation, the nursing board investigation, all that unpleasantness that drove a wedge between us. The unpleasantness where you and David framed me for stealing narcotics to eliminate me from the hospital sale? Sarah, that's not what happened. You know that's not what happened. There were genuine concerns about inventory discrepancies and the investigation." "Marcus, stop." "Stop what? Stop lying. Stop pretending. Stop acting like you believe your own story." Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. "Sarah, I think you're still upset about the nursing board decision, and I understand that. But you can't seriously believe that David and I would deliberately hurt our own sister. I believe exactly that because that's exactly what you did. Honey, you're not thinking clearly. This inheritance is obviously overwhelming, and maybe you're letting it affect your judgment about family relationships. Why don't you take some time to process everything, and then we'll sit down together and work through these feelings." Feelings. As if my accurate understanding of their criminal conspiracy was an emotional problem rather than a factual assessment. "Marcus, let me explain something to you. Mr. Wellington left me more than money. He left me evidence, recorded conversations, financial records, witness statements. He left me proof of everything you and David did to destroy my life." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, more calculating, stripped of the fake warmth he'd been using. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you have, but you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. False allegations can have serious legal consequences." "Can they? Like the legal consequences of framing your sister for pharmaceutical theft?" "I'm going to pretend you didn't say that. But Sarah, if you're thinking about pursuing some kind of legal action based on whatever misinformation this Wellington guy collected, you should consider the impact on Tommy. Do you really want to drag your son through a public legal battle that will hurt the whole family? There it was, the threat disguised as concern, the manipulation wrapped in fake worry about Tommy's welfare. Marcus was already trying to use my love for my son as a weapon against me, just like he'd used my vulnerability as a single mother to make his theft accusations seem credible. Marcus, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I'm listening. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will be contacting you and David about criminal charges related to fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering, and evidence fabrication. The charges will be followed by asset forfeiture procedures to seize everything you bought with money stolen from the hospital sale. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You destroyed my life for money, Marcus. Now you're going to discover what that actually costs. Sarah, your family. We're family. You can't do this to your own brothers. You did it to your own sister first. I hung up the phone and stood in my new living room, looking out at the city lights and thinking about family loyalty, criminal justice, and the difference between forgiveness and accountability. Some relationships, I was learning, didn't survive the discovery of what people were really capable of doing to each other, and some justice was worth waiting 3 years to deliver. Tomorrow, my brothers would wake up to discover that destroying their sister's life had consequences they'd never anticipated. Tonight, I would sleep in a real bed for the first time in 3 years, knowing that my son was safe in his own room, and that justice was finally coming for the people who thought family connections made them untouchable. Some inheritances, I realized, included the power to balance scales that had been tipped in the wrong direction for far too long. The knock on my door came at 6:22 a.m., sharp and official in the way that only federal agents managed to achieve. Through the penthouse's security monitor, I watched 2 men in dark suits show their badges to the doorman, their expressions carrying the focused intensity of people conducting serious business at an unseemly hour. I wasn't their target. I was their key witness. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Agent Rodriguez. This is Agent Thompson, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to discuss the Wellington investigation with you. I led them to the living room where Tommy was eating breakfast and getting ready for his first day at the private school that Jonathan Hayes had enrolled him in, a place where his medical needs could be accommodated and his education could continue without the disruptions that had characterized our homeless years. Tommy, could you finish getting ready in your room? These gentlemen need to talk with me about some legal matters. My son looked at the federal agents with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate adults based on their potential to disrupt his fragile stability. Agent Rodriguez smiled at him, a genuine expression that seemed to pass Tommy's inspection. Cool apartment, Tommy said, gathering his new school supplies. Mom, what time will you pick me up? 3:30, just like we discussed. And Tommy, if you need your medication during the day, the school nurse has everything she needs. After Tommy left for school, driven by a professional service that included security protocols I was still learning to accept, I sat down with the federal agents who would determine whether my brothers faced consequences for their crimes or continued living as if destroying their sister had been a successful business strategy. Ms. Mitchell, we've reviewed the evidence that Mr. Wellington's investigation team compiled. The documentation is extensive and appears to support multiple federal charges against both of your brothers. Agent Thompson opened a file that looked thick enough to contain a novel. Recorded conversations, financial records, witness statements, document analysis. It's one of the most thorough fraud investigations we've seen from a private source. What exactly did Mr. Wellington's team discover? Evidence that your brothers engaged in criminal conspiracy to defraud you of your inheritance by fabricating evidence of pharmaceutical theft. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. Phone recordings where they discuss planting morphine vials in your personal belongings. Bank records showing payments to hospital employees who provided false testimony. Email exchanges detailing their timeline for eliminating you from the hospital sale. They were that careless with evidence? Your brother Marcus apparently documented the entire conspiracy, believing that detailed records would protect him if David ever tried to implicate him in wrongdoing. He never imagined that someone with Mr. Wellington's resources would gain access to those communications. Agent Thompson leaned forward, his expression serious. Ms. Mitchell, pursuing federal charges will require your cooperation as a witness. The process will be emotionally difficult, publicly messy, and potentially dangerous if your brothers decide to fight the charges aggressively. Dangerous how? Desperate people facing long prison sentences sometimes make poor decisions about intimidating witnesses or destroying evidence. We'll provide protection if necessary, but you should understand that this won't be a quiet legal proceeding. I thought about the phone call from Marcus, about his immediate shift from fake warmth to veiled threats, about the calculation in his voice when he'd tried to use Tommy's welfare as leverage against me. Agent Rodriguez, what happens if I don't cooperate with the prosecution? Then your brothers face no consequences for destroying your life and stealing your inheritance. They continue living in their mansions, enjoying their wealth, and believing that family connections protect them from justice. And if I do cooperate? Then they face federal fraud charges with sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, plus asset forfeiture of everything purchased with proceeds from their crimes. The choice was simpler than the agents probably expected. My brothers had shown no remorse, offered no genuine apologies, made no attempt to repair the damage they'd caused. Marcus's phone call had been pure manipulation, an attempt to use our biological relationship to escape consequences for deliberate cruelty. I'll cooperate fully with the prosecution. Ms. Mitchell, there's something else you should know. This morning, agents are executing search warrants on both of your brothers' homes and offices. They're being arrested simultaneously to prevent coordination of their defense strategies. I looked at my watch. 8:47 a.m. At this moment, Marcus and David were probably being handcuffed in their expensive homes, reading search warrants that would seize the computers, phones, and financial records that documented their conspiracy. Will they be able to make bail? Given the flight risk assessment and the amount of money involved, we'll be requesting they be held without bond pending trial. But Ms. Mitchell, even if bail is granted, the asset forfeiture procedures begin immediately. Their bank accounts will be frozen, their properties will be seized, and they'll lose access to the wealth they gained by destroying your life. My phone rang. David's number. I showed the screen to Agent Rodriguez, who nodded approval for me to answer. Sarah, what the hell have you done? David's voice was raw with panic and rage. The FBI is tearing apart my house. My wife is crying. My neighbors are staring. I've done exactly what you and Marcus did to me, David. Except I had evidence, and you had lies. You can't be serious about pursuing this. We're family, Sarah. Family doesn't destroy family over business disagreements. Family doesn't frame family for felonies to steal their inheritance. That's not what happened, and you know it. There were legitimate concerns about drug inventory and the investigation. David, stop. The FBI has recordings of you and Marcus planning the entire conspiracy. They have bank records showing payments to witnesses. They have everything. A pause. The sound of someone processing the collapse of everything they thought they'd built their life on. Sarah, listen to me. Whatever you think you know, whatever evidence you think you have, this will hurt Tommy too. Do you want your son to watch his uncles go to prison? Do you want him to grow up knowing his mother destroyed his family? The same manipulation Marcus had attempted, the same effort to use my love for Tommy as a weapon against my pursuit of justice. But David's version carried an edge of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was facing. David, Tommy understands the difference between family and people who share your DNA. Real family doesn't abandon a sick child because they've eliminated his mother from their business deals. You're making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life. No, David. The mistake was thinking that destroying your sister wouldn't have consequences. After I hung up, Agent Thompson looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Ms. Mitchell, your brothers will likely attempt more contact, possibly through other family members or mutual friends. They may offer financial settlements, public apologies, or promises of future cooperation if you drop the charges. They don't have anything I need anymore. They may not understand that immediately. People who've operated with impunity for years sometimes can't process that their victims have gained power. I thought about the 3 years Tommy and I had spent living in our car, about the medication we'd rationed, about the nights I'd listened to my son's labored breathing and wondered if his condition was worsening because we couldn't afford proper medical care. Agent Rodriguez, how long will this prosecution take? Federal fraud cases typically take 18 to 24 months from indictment to trial. But Ms. Mitchell, given the strength of the evidence, we expect your brother's attorneys will encourage plea bargains to avoid the risk of maximum sentences. What would plea bargains involve? Prison time, complete asset forfeiture, and permanent admission of guilt. They would lose everything they gained from destroying you, and they would face public acknowledgement that their success was built on criminal fraud. I stood at the penthouse windows, looking down at the city where I'd once been respected, where I'd later been destroyed, where I was now positioned to deliver justice that had been delayed but not denied. Some debts, I was learning, accumulated interest over time, and some justice was worth waiting 3 years to collect. The news broke at 3:47 p.m. while I was driving to pick up Tommy from his first day at the private school that would finally provide him with the educational stability he deserved. The radio news bulletin was brief but comprehensive. 2 prominent businessmen, brothers Marcus and David Mitchell, were arrested this morning on federal fraud charges related to a conspiracy to defraud their sister of hospital sale proceeds. The arrests come following an investigation initiated by evidence provided by the late billionaire Robert Wellington III, who left his entire estate to their victim, former nurse Sarah Mitchell. By the time I reached Tommy's school, my phone had received 47 calls from reporters, distant relatives, former colleagues, and people I hadn't heard from in years who were suddenly interested in reconnecting now that I was worth nearly $3 billion. "How was your first day?" I asked Tommy as he settled into our new car, a modest sedan that Jonathan Hayes had insisted was more practical than the luxury vehicles that came with my inheritance. "Good. The teachers actually know about my medical condition, and they have protocols for handling seizures if they happen during class." Tommy buckled his seatbelt and studied my face with the perceptive attention he'd developed during our difficult years. "Mom, you look different. Like something big happened today. Uncle Marcus and Uncle David were arrested this morning." Tommy was quiet for several moments, processing this information with the careful thought that characterized his approach to important news. "Are you sad about it?" The question surprised me with its directness, but Tommy had learned to cut through adult complications to reach essential emotional truths. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sad. I'm relieved, I think. Like something that was broken is finally being fixed." "Good. They deserved to get in trouble for what they did to us." When we returned to the penthouse, Jonathan Hayes was waiting in the lobby with news that would complicate the already surreal trajectory of our day. "Ms. Mitchell, we need to discuss a development regarding your brother's legal situation. They've retained criminal defense attorneys, and those attorneys have requested a meeting to discuss potential plea negotiations." "Already?" "Their lawyers reviewed the evidence this afternoon and advised immediate settlement discussions rather than fighting charges they cannot win. Ms. Mitchell, they want to make a deal." We rode the elevator to our apartment in silence, Tommy immediately disappearing into his room to start homework assignments that were academically challenging rather than just busy work designed to keep him occupied. For the first time in 3 years, my son was being treated like an intelligent young person with potential rather than a problem to be managed. "What kind of deal are they proposing?" I asked Jonathan once we were settled in the living room that still felt too elegant to belong to people who'd been homeless a week ago. "Complete confession to all charges, surrender of all assets purchased with hospital sale proceeds, 10 years in federal prison for each brother, and a public apology acknowledging the fraud they committed against you." In exchange for what? Avoiding federal trial and the possibility of 20-year sentences. "Ms. Mitchell, their attorneys are recommending acceptance because the evidence against them is overwhelming and incontrovertible." I thought about Marcus and David, about the way they'd looked at me during the nursing board hearing. Cold, calculating, confident that they'd successfully eliminated a problem. They'd shown no remorse then, offered no apologies during the 3 years that followed, made no attempt to help Tommy and me when we were living in our car. "Jonathan, if they accept this plea deal, do they admit guilt publicly?" "Yes. Complete public acknowledgement of the conspiracy, the evidence fabrication, the witness tampering, everything. Their confession would be entered into court records and reported by every media outlet that's been covering this story." "And the 10-year sentences?" "Federal minimum security facilities, but prison nonetheless. They would lose their medical licenses, their business licenses, their ability to practice in any healthcare-related field. They would emerge from prison at ages 70 and 68 respectively, with no assets and no professional prospects." I walked to the windows that had become my thinking space, looking down at the city that held so many different versions of my life: the successful nurse, the destroyed accused thief, the homeless mother, and now the billionaire seeking justice. Jonathan, what happens to their families, their wives, their children? Their immediate families weren't involved in the conspiracy, so they retain whatever personal assets existed before the hospital sale. But the lifestyle funded by fraudulent proceeds, the mansions, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, all of that disappears. So their families become innocent victims of their choices. Yes, which is often the most difficult aspect of white-collar criminal prosecution. The conspirators' families suffer consequences for crimes they didn't commit. I thought about my sister-in-law Rebecca, David's wife, who'd never been particularly warm to me but had never actively participated in my destruction. About Marcus's children, my nephews who were now teenagers and would spend their high school years watching their father serve a prison sentence for fraud. Jonathan, could we structure a settlement that provides support for their families while still holding Marcus and David accountable? What did you have in mind? What if we establish education funds for their children, modest living allowances for their wives, enough to ensure they don't lose their homes or their stability, but funded separately from any plea agreement? Jonathan studied my face with the expression of someone trying to understand motivations that seemed inconsistent with seeking maximum punishment. Ms. Mitchell, that's remarkably generous considering what your brothers did to you and Tommy. It's not generous. It's strategic. I want Marcus and David to face full consequences for their choices, but I don't want their children to pay the price for their parents' crimes. Tommy and I know what that feels like. I can include family support provisions in the settlement negotiations. But Ms. Mitchell, your brother's attorneys will likely interpret your willingness to support their families as evidence that you're open to reducing the criminal penalties as well. Then make it clear that family support and criminal accountability are separate issues. Their wives and children get protection from financial devastation, but Marcus and David still serve their prison sentences and lose everything they stole. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, Rebecca's voice was unmistakable. Sarah, please don't hang up. I know you have every right to hate our family, but I need to talk to you about the children. Rebecca, I don't hate your family. I hate what David and Marcus did to mine. The attorneys are saying David could go to prison for 10 years. Sarah, my kids are 15 and 17. They're going to spend their senior year in high school watching their father serve a federal prison sentence. Rebecca, their father spent 3 years watching his nephew live in a car because his medical needs were too expensive for his homeless mother to afford. I know. God, Sarah, I know. And I'm not calling to ask you to drop the charges or reduce the sentences. What David did was unforgivable. Rebecca's voice was shaking with emotion that sounded genuine rather than manipulative. I'm calling to ask if you'll let me help Tommy somehow. Let me do something to make up for the years we didn't help when we should have. Tommy doesn't need help anymore, Rebecca. He has access to the best medical care in the country and educational opportunities that will let him reach his full potential. Then let me help you. Let me testify at their trial about what I witnessed, about the conversations I overheard, about the things they said about you when they thought no one was paying attention. I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that some people had been passive bystanders to injustice rather than active participants. Rebecca, what did you witness? David bragging about how easy it was to fool the nursing board investigators. Marcus joking about Sarah the drug dealer getting what she deserved. Conversations about how much money they saved by eliminating your share of the hospital sale. Her voice was getting stronger, more determined. Sarah, I should have spoken up then. I should have done something to stop them. I was a coward, and I'm ashamed of that. Why are you willing to testify against your own husband? Because my children need to understand that actions have consequences, that family loyalty doesn't include protecting people who commit crimes, and that sometimes the right thing to do requires courage, even when it costs you everything. After Rebecca and I finished our conversation, I realized that justice was more complicated than simply punishing the guilty. It also required protecting the innocent and providing opportunities for genuine redemption. Some families, I was learning, could be rebuilt after betrayal. Others needed to be redefined entirely. But justice, real justice, meant ensuring that everyone faced appropriate consequences for their choices while still protecting the people who hadn't made those choices themselves. Tomorrow, I would accept the plea agreement that would send my brothers to prison for 10 years. Tonight, I would set up education funds that would ensure their children could build better lives than their parents had chosen. Some justice, I was discovering, was large enough to include both accountability and mercy. The courtroom was packed on the day Marcus and David formally entered their guilty pleas, filled with reporters, former hospital employees, nursing colleagues, and family members whose lives had been affected by their conspiracy. I sat in the front row with Tommy, watching my brothers stand before a federal judge to confess to crimes they'd spent 3 years denying. Judge Patricia Harrison reviewed the plea agreements with the methodical precision of someone who'd presided over thousands of criminal cases and understood the difference between justice and vengeance. Mr. Marcus Mitchell, you are pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and racketeering. Do you understand that this plea carries a mandatory 10-year federal prison sentence? Yes, Your Honor. And you acknowledge that your actions caused financial and emotional damages to your sister Sarah Mitchell and her minor son, including loss of professional license, homelessness, and inability to afford medical care for a child with chronic health conditions? Marcus's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. David Mitchell, you are entering identical guilty pleas with identical acknowledgments? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Harrison consulted the victim impact statements that Tommy and I had submitted, documents that detailed not just our financial losses, but the human cost of 3 years living in poverty because of their deliberate fraud. Before I accept these pleas, I want to address the court about the nature of the crimes committed here. These defendants didn't steal from strangers or corporations. They systematically destroyed the life of their own sister, a healthcare professional who had dedicated her career to saving lives in order to increase their personal wealth from a business sale. The judge's words carried weight in the silent courtroom, and I saw several reporters taking detailed notes about her comments. They fabricated evidence, bribed witnesses, and perjured themselves in legal proceedings to eliminate their sister from receiving her rightful inheritance. As a result of their conspiracy, Ms. Sarah Mitchell lost her nursing license, her home, her financial security, and her ability to provide adequate medical care for her disabled son. The court finds these crimes particularly egregious because they involved the deliberate betrayal of family relationships and trust. The defendants used their victim's love for her son as a vulnerability to be exploited, knowing that a single mother with medical bills would be desperate enough to appear guilty of pharmaceutical theft. Judge Harrison looked directly at Marcus and David, her expression stern but not vindictive. The plea agreements include complete asset forfeiture of all property and investments purchased with proceeds from the fraudulent hospital sale. Both defendants will surrender their medical licenses, their business assets, and their ability to work in any healthcare-related field following their release from federal prison. Additionally, both defendants will make public statements acknowledging their guilt and the impact of their crimes on their victims. These statements will be distributed to all media outlets covering this case. The asset forfeiture portion of the sentencing was comprehensive and devastating. Marcus and David would lose their mansions, luxury cars, investment portfolios, and country club memberships. They would begin their prison sentences immediately and emerge 10 years later with no money, no professional prospects, and permanent felony records that would affect the rest of their lives. But perhaps more importantly, they would serve those 10 years knowing that their victim had used their stolen inheritance to build something extraordinary. Because while they sat in federal prison, I would be using Robert Wellington's gift to transform healthcare access for people who couldn't afford quality medical treatment. After the sentencing, Jonathan Hayes and I met with reporters outside the courthouse to announce the launch of the Mitchell Foundation for Healthcare Access, a $2 billion initiative that would provide free medical care, nursing education scholarships, and support for healthcare workers facing false accusations or professional persecution. Ms. Mitchell, one reporter asked, do you feel vindicated by today's sentences? I thought about the question while looking at the courthouse steps where Marcus and David had been led away in handcuffs an hour earlier. I feel like justice has been served, and Tommy and I can finally move forward with our lives. But more importantly, I feel like we can use this experience to help other people who face similar situations. What do you mean by similar situation? Healthcare workers who are falsely accused of misconduct, families who can't afford medical treatment for their children, People who believe that wealth and family connections protect them from consequences for criminal behavior. Are you satisfied with the 10-year sentences? I'm satisfied that my brothers will face appropriate consequences for their choices while their families receive support to rebuild their lives. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's also about restoration and prevention. Tommy, standing beside me with the confidence that came from knowing his medical needs would never again be rationed due to cost, added his own perspective to the media coverage. My uncles hurt us because they wanted more money, he said, with the direct honesty that 14-year-olds bring to complex situations. Now, they have no money, and we have enough money to help other kids whose families can't afford medicine. That seems fair to me. That evening, Tommy and I had dinner at the penthouse with Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, the pediatric neurologist who had become not just his doctor, but a consultant for the Foundation's children's medical initiatives. Tommy's seizure activity has decreased by 70% since beginning the new medication protocol, Dr. Yamamoto reported. His cognitive function is improving, his energy levels are higher, and he's responding well to the physical therapy program. What's the long-term prognosis? I asked. With consistent treatment and monitoring, Tommy should be able to live a completely normal life. The neurological condition that seemed so limiting when he couldn't access proper care is quite manageable with the right medical support. I looked at my son, who was reading a book about marine biology, a subject he'd become passionate about since gaining access to educational resources that challenged rather than simply accommodated his medical needs. Tommy, Dr. Yamamoto says you might be interested in attending the Marine Science Summer Program at Woods Hole next year. Really? The one where you can work with actual researchers on ocean conservation projects? The same one. If you're interested, the Foundation will sponsor other students whose families can't afford the program fees. Tommy's smile was radiant. Mom, do you think Uncle Marcus and Uncle David ever imagined that stealing our inheritance would end up helping so many other people? I think they probably imagined keeping all the money for themselves and never facing any consequences for what they did to us. Then they were pretty bad at imagining, Tommy said with the matter-of-fact assessment that had become his trademark response to adult failures. Later that night, after Tommy was asleep in his own room with access to all the medical monitoring equipment that ensured his safety, I stood at the penthouse windows looking down at the city where my life had been destroyed and rebuilt. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Marcus and David's prison facility. Apparently they were still trying to negotiate, still trying to manipulate, still unable to accept that their victim now possessed resources they couldn't match and resolve they couldn't break. I didn't return their calls. Some conversations were no longer necessary. Some relationships couldn't be rebuilt after betrayal. But some justice was worth waiting 3 years to deliver, and some victories were sweet enough to justify the suffering that preceded them. Tomorrow, the Mitchell Foundation would begin accepting applications from nursing students who couldn't afford medical school tuition, from families whose children needed expensive treatments, from healthcare workers facing false accusations similar to the ones that had destroyed my career. My brothers had stolen $50 million from me to increase their personal wealth. I was using $2.8 billion to ensure that other people facing similar situations would have resources to fight back. Some inheritances, I was learning, were worth more than money. They were worth the opportunity to transform injustice into opportunity, suffering into service, and betrayal into a foundation for building something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. Justice, it turned out, was not just about punishment. It was about using power responsibly to protect people who didn't yet have power to protect themselves. And sometimes, the greatest victory was not destroying your enemies, but building something so valuable from their betrayal that they spent the rest of their lives understanding what they'd really lost when they chose greed over family. 2 years after my brother's imprisonment, I stood in the lobby of the Mitchell Foundation Medical Center, watching the dedication ceremony for our new wing devoted to treating children with neurological conditions. The facility represented everything that had emerged from the ashes of our family's destruction. World-class medical care funded by justice, staffed by professionals who understood that healing required both clinical expertise and genuine compassion. Tommy, now 16 and thriving academically at the prep school that had nurtured his interest in marine biology, served as the ceremony's keynote speaker with the poise of someone who'd learned early that personal experience could be transformed into advocacy for others. 3 years ago, my mom and I lived in our car because we couldn't afford my medical treatments, he told the audience of doctors, nurses, families, and media representatives. Today, no child in this city will ever face that choice again, because this medical center provides free care to anyone who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but I found myself thinking about the letter I'd received that morning from Marcus, his first communication since beginning his prison sentence that wasn't an attempt to negotiate or manipulate. Sarah, I watched the news coverage of Tommy's speech at the medical center dedication, and I need to tell you something I should have said 3 years ago. I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm ashamed of what I destroyed. Prison has given me time to understand the magnitude of what David and I did to you and Tommy. We didn't just steal money. We stole your career, your reputation, your sense of security, and your son's access to medical care. We destroyed the life of someone who had dedicated herself to healing others, simply because we wanted more wealth than we deserved. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or early release or any kind of special consideration. I'm writing because I need you to know that I understand now what I was too selfish to see then. You were always the best of our family, and we eliminated you because your integrity made our greed look uglier than we could bear. The medical center you've built will help thousands of children over the coming decades. The nursing scholarships you've funded will train healthcare workers who understand that service means sacrifice. The legal defense fund you've established will protect other professionals from the kind of false accusations we used against you. You've taken the worst thing that ever happened to you and transformed it into the best thing that will happen to countless other families. David and I took $50 million from you and used it to buy mansions, luxury cars, and social status that impressed people we didn't even like. You took $2.8 billion and used it to build something that will outlast all of us. A foundation dedicated to ensuring that no family faces the choices we forced you and Tommy to make. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I don't expect you to visit or include me in Tommy's life when I'm released. I just need you to know that even from federal prison, I can see the difference between wealth and worth, between success and significance, between what we thought we were building and what you've actually accomplished. I'm sorry, Sarah, for everything. For the 3 years you and Tommy suffered because of our choices, for the career we destroyed, for the trust we betrayed, for the family we broke. I hope someday Tommy will be able to think of his uncles as cautionary tales rather than enemies, people who made terrible choices and faced appropriate consequences, but who learned too late the difference between right and wrong. With regret and respect, Marcus. The letter was still folded in my purse when Dr. Yamamoto approached me during the reception following Tommy's speech, her expression carrying news that I'd been anticipating for months. Sarah, we've received approval from the FDA for the clinical trial protocol. The new treatment for Tommy's condition could help thousands of children worldwide if the results match our preliminary data. The clinical trial represented another unexpected development in our journey. Tommy's neurological condition, which had seemed like such a devastating limitation when we couldn't afford proper treatment, had turned out to provide valuable insights for research that could benefit other children facing similar diagnoses. When does the trial begin? Next month. Tommy will be the first patient enrolled, and if you're comfortable with it, we'd like to document his progress for medical conferences and research publications. His case could change how we approach pediatric neurology treatment globally. I looked across the reception area where Tommy was talking animatedly with other teenagers who were participating in the medical center's peer support programs, kids whose families could now access world-class care regardless of their financial situation. Tommy, could you come here for a minute? Dr. Yamamoto has news about the clinical trial. My son approached with the easy confidence that had replaced the careful wariness that had characterized his demeanor during our homeless years. Good nutrition, consistent medical care, and educational stability had transformed him from a fragile child managing chronic illness into a healthy teenager pursuing ambitious academic goals. The FDA approved the trial protocol, Dr. Yamamoto explained. Tommy, If you're willing to participate, you could help develop treatments that benefit thousands of other children with similar conditions. So I'd be like a test case for helping other kids? Exactly. Your participation could lead to breakthrough treatments that make this condition much easier to manage for future patients. Tommy considered the proposal with the thoughtful analysis that had become his trademark approach to important decisions. Will it hurt? Some discomfort during the monitoring phases, but nothing worse than what you've already experienced with your current treatment protocol. And it could help other kids avoid living in cars with their moms? It could help other families manage this condition without the financial stress that made your situation so difficult. Tommy looked at me with the expression he used when seeking confirmation for decisions he'd already made. Mom, I think we should do it. If my stupid neurological condition can actually help other people, that seems like a pretty good trade. That evening, Tommy and I had dinner on the penthouse terrace, looking out at the city where we'd once been homeless, and were now positioned to transform healthcare access for thousands of families facing similar challenges. Mom, can I ask you something about the letter from Uncle Marcus? You saw that? You left it on the kitchen counter, and I recognize his handwriting from the Christmas cards he used to send. Tommy finished his dinner and leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone whose medical needs were completely managed. Do you think people can actually change? What do you mean? I mean, Uncle Marcus sounds different in that letter than he sounded during the court stuff. Like he actually understands what he did wrong instead of just being sorry he got caught. I thought about Marcus's letter, about the difference between strategic apologies designed to reduce consequences and genuine remorse that acknowledge the full scope of damage caused by deliberate choices. I think some people can learn from their mistakes, but only after they've faced real consequences for their actions. Prison has a way of clarifying priorities that wealth and privilege can obscure. Are you going to write back to him? I don't know. What do you think I should do? Tommy was quiet for several minutes, processing the complexity of forgiveness, justice, and family relationships with the wisdom that had developed through experiencing the worst and best of human behavior. I think you should do whatever feels right to you, but you shouldn't feel bad about not forgiving people who hurt us on purpose. Some things are too broken to fix, even if people are sorry about breaking them. And if Uncle Marcus really has changed, if his regret is genuine, then he can live with being genuinely sorry, and that will be part of his consequence for making terrible choices. But Mom, his feelings about what he did aren't more important than our safety and happiness. I looked at my 16-year-old son, marveling at the emotional intelligence that had emerged from surviving injustice and discovering that survival could be transformed into service for others facing similar struggles. Tommy, when did you become so wise? When I learned that bad things happening to you doesn't make you a victim forever. Sometimes bad things just teach you how to recognize good things when they finally show up. That night, I wrote a brief response to Marcus's letter. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that genuine remorse was better than continued denial, and that personal growth could occur even in federal prison. Some relationships, I was learning, couldn't be rebuilt after betrayal. But some justice was large enough to include the possibility of redemption, even for people who'd forfeited the right to expect it. The most important measure of our victory wasn't my brother's punishment. It was Tommy's transformation from a sick child rationing medication to a healthy teenager whose experience could help develop treatments for thousands of other children. Some inheritances, I realized, were worth more than money. They were worth the opportunity to transform suffering into service, injustice into advocacy, and personal healing into institutional change that would outlast all of us. Justice, it turned out, was not just about evening scores. It was about building something so valuable from destruction that the destruction itself became worthwhile. 5 years after Robert Wellington's death transformed our lives, I received an unexpected visitor at the Mitchell Foundation headquarters. David stood in the lobby looking older, thinner, and carrying himself with the careful humility of someone who'd learned that wealth and arrogance were privileges that could be permanently revoked. He'd been released from federal prison 6 months early for good behavior and participation in educational programs, but his appearance suggested that 5 years of incarceration had accomplished what decades of privilege had failed to provide: genuine understanding of consequences. Sarah, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you have no obligation to give me any of your time. I led him to a small conference room adjacent to my office, noting how he looked around the foundation building with what appeared to be genuine awe rather than the calculating assessment that had characterized his pre-prison evaluation of everything around him. "The medical center is remarkable," he said, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone still adjusting to freedom. "I've been following the news coverage of your work. The pediatric neurology program, the nursing scholarships, the legal defense fund for healthcare workers facing false accusations. David, what do you want?" "I want to tell you what I should have said 5 years ago, before federal agents arrested me in my driveway while my neighbors watched through their windows." I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic remorse, but finding instead the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying genuine guilt for an extended period. "I'm listening. I destroyed the life of the best person in our family because I was jealous of your integrity and terrified that your moral standards would interfere with my greed." David's voice was steady but quiet, as if he'd rehearsed these words during long prison nights. "Marcus and I didn't just steal your inheritance. We eliminated you because your character made our corruption look uglier than we could tolerate." "Why now, David? Why this conversation after 5 years of silence?" "Because I'm dying." The words hung between us like a diagnosis neither of us had expected. David pulled out medical documents from the folder he'd carried into the meeting, spreading them across the conference table with the same methodical precision he'd once used for business presentations. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The prison medical facility detected it during routine screening 3 months before my release. The oncologists are recommending palliative care rather than aggressive treatment." I looked at the medical reports, my nursing background automatically processing the terminology, prognosis timelines, and treatment options outlined in clinical language that couldn't soften the brutality of the diagnosis. "How long?" 6 to 8 months, possibly less. "The cancer is aggressive and has already metastasized to my liver and lungs." "David, I'm sorry. Whatever happened between us, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. I'm not here for sympathy, Sarah. I'm here because I have something that belongs to you, and I need to return it before I die." David reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet jewelry box that I recognized immediately. Our mother's engagement ring, the one that was supposed to pass to the next generation of Mitchell women, the one that had disappeared from her estate items after the funeral. "You took Mom's ring?" "Marcus and I divided her jewelry when we settled the estate. We told ourselves you didn't deserve anything from the family assets since you weren't contributing to the hospital's success." His voice carried shame that sounded genuine rather than performative. "Sarah, we stole from you before we ever framed you for pharmaceutical theft. We'd been systematically eliminating you from family inheritance for years." I took the ring box, feeling the weight of jewelry I'd never expected to see again, remembering our mother wearing it during family dinners and holiday celebrations when our relationships had been built on love rather than financial calculation. "Why are you returning it now?" "Because I spent 5 years in federal prison learning the difference between family and people who share your DNA. Because I watched news coverage of Tommy's medical research participation and realized that the nephew I helped make homeless is now contributing to breakthrough treatments that will help thousands of other children." David pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be financial documents and legal paperwork. "There's something else. Marcus and I had offshore accounts that the federal investigation didn't discover. Money we'd hidden in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Funds that weren't seized during the asset forfeiture proceedings." I felt my stomach clench with the familiar mixture of anger and disappointment that accompanied every revelation about the scope of my brother's financial crimes. "How much money?" "Approximately $12 million in hidden assets. Money that rightfully belongs to you as part of the hospital sale proceeds we stole." David spread out bank statements and account information with the thoroughness of someone making a final confession. "I'm transferring all of it to the Mitchell Foundation, not as charity or apology, but as restitution for theft." "David, the statute of limitations on additional criminal charges has expired, yes, but Sarah, I'm not returning this money to avoid prosecution. I'm returning it because keeping stolen assets while dying of cancer seems like the kind of moral failure that defines how people remember you after you're gone." I looked at the financial documents, calculating how $12 million additional dollars could expand the foundation's programs, fund more scholarships, provide free medical care to even more families facing impossible choices between treatment and financial survival. What about Marcus? Does he know about these accounts? Marcus died in prison 18 months ago. Heart attack during his sleep, the stress of incarceration, and the weight of what we'd done. His body couldn't handle it. David's voice broke slightly. Sarah, my brother died knowing that the worst thing he'd ever done was destroying his sister's life for money he didn't need to buy things that didn't make him happy. I absorbed this news, Marcus's death, David's terminal diagnosis, the hidden millions that represented years of additional theft, and realized that the Mitchell family as I'd known it was ending with this conversation. David, what do you want from me? Forgiveness? Reconciliation? Some kind of deathbed absolution? I want you to know that watching you transform our betrayal into a foundation that serves thousands of people has been the only source of pride I've felt since federal agents handcuffed me in my driveway. David gathered the financial documents into neat stacks. You took the worst thing Marcus and I ever did and used it to build something beautiful. And that's enough for you? Sarah, I destroyed my own sister's life and spent 5 years in federal prison for fraud. I'm dying of cancer with no family relationships, no friends, no legacy except criminal conviction and the knowledge that I caused immeasurable suffering to people I was supposed to protect. David stood slowly, preparing to leave this conference room and return to whatever remained of his life. But my sister, the sister I betrayed, has built a medical foundation that will help people for generations. She's turned my nephew into a young man who participates in clinical trials to help other children with similar conditions. She's created scholarship programs that will train nurses who understand that healing requires both clinical skill and genuine compassion. David, that's enough for me, Sarah, knowing that our family's story ends with your triumphs rather than our crimes. That's more redemption than I deserve and more legacy than I had any right to hope for. After David left, I sat in the conference room, holding our mother's engagement ring and thinking about family, forgiveness, and the strange mathematics of justice that sometimes included mercy, even when mercy wasn't requested or expected. Tomorrow, I would deposit $12 million in hidden assets into the foundation's accounts, funding expanded programs that would help thousands more families facing medical crises. Tonight, I would call Tommy and tell him about his Uncle David's terminal diagnosis and his Uncle Marcus's death, helping my son process the end of family relationships that had been broken beyond repair but had somehow contributed to building something valuable from their destruction. Some stories, I was learning, ended not with reconciliation, but with understanding. Some justice was large enough to include both consequences and compassion. And sometimes, the greatest victory wasn't destroying your enemies. It was building something so meaningful from their betrayal that their crimes became the foundation for extraordinary service to others. David would die knowing that his theft had funded medical care for thousands of children. That wasn't forgiveness exactly. But it was a kind of redemption that neither of us had expected when this story began. 1 year later, I stood beside Tommy at David's graveside service, a small gathering of perhaps 20 people who had come to witness the end of a life defined more by its mistakes than its accomplishments. The funeral director had asked if I wanted to speak at the service, and I'd agreed, though not for the reasons most people probably expected. David Mitchell was my brother, I began, looking out at the faces of people who had known him before federal prison transformed him from a successful businessman into someone learning the difference between wealth and worth. He was also someone who made terrible choices that hurt people he was supposed to protect and love. Tommy stood beside me with the quiet dignity that had become his trademark, now 17, and preparing for early admission to marine biology programs at several prestigious universities. His participation in the clinical trials had led to breakthrough treatments that were already helping children around the world manage neurological conditions that had once seemed insurmountable. David spent the last year of his life trying to understand how greed had transformed him into someone who could destroy his own family for financial gain. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew that some actions move beyond the possibility of forgiveness into territory where the best you can hope for is understanding. I looked down at the casket that contained a man who had died, knowing that his crimes had ultimately funded medical care for thousands of children, nursing education for hundreds of students, and legal defense for healthcare workers facing false accusations. But David also spent his final months ensuring that his remaining assets were transferred to the Mitchell Foundation, bringing the total restitution to nearly $15 million. Money that had been stolen from our family is now providing free medical care to families who can't afford treatment for their children. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. David's theft had been transformed into the largest donation in the Foundation's history. I'm not here to praise my brother or to suggest that good intentions at the end of life erase years of deliberate harm. I'm here to acknowledge that sometimes the most valuable thing people can do is face the truth about their choices and try to repair whatever damage is still repairable. After the service, Tommy and I drove to the Mitchell Foundation Medical Center, where construction crews were putting finishing touches on the new research wing that would house the pediatric neurology program that had grown out of Tommy's treatment and clinical trial participation. Mom, do you think Uncle David understood what he'd really done to us? I thought about David's final months, about the way terminal illness had stripped away the rationalizations and self-deception that had allowed him to live with the consequences of destroying his sister's life. I think dying gave him clarity that wealth and privilege had prevented him from developing earlier. But Tommy, understanding consequences and facing consequences aren't the same thing as erasing consequences. What do you mean? I mean that David's remorse was genuine, his restitution was complete, and his final actions demonstrated real understanding of the harm he'd caused. But that doesn't change the 3 years we spent homeless, or the damage to my nursing career, or the time you went without proper medical care because of his choices. Tommy nodded with the wisdom that had developed through experiencing both the worst and best of human behavior. So acknowledgement and accountability are better than denial and blame, but they don't make everything magically okay. Exactly. Justice isn't just about punishment or forgiveness. It's about truth, consequences, and ensuring that harmful actions lead to constructive outcomes whenever possible. We walked through the medical center that had been built with money stolen from us and returned through guilt and terminal illness, past examination rooms where children received free treatment, through hallways lined with photos of nursing scholarship recipients who were learning that healthcare required both clinical expertise and genuine compassion. In the pediatric wing, Dr. Yamamoto was conducting rounds with medical students who were learning about the neurological condition that had once made Tommy's life so difficult but had contributed to research breakthroughs that would benefit thousands of other children. Tommy, are you ready for the university interviews next month? I think so. Stanford, UC San Diego, and Woods Hole all have marine biology programs that focus on ocean conservation research. And Mom, they all know about the clinical trial participation and want to discuss how medical research can inform environmental science. I felt pride watching my son discuss his academic future with the confidence of someone whose potential had been recognized and nurtured rather than simply managed or accommodated. What will you tell them about how your medical condition influenced your interest in research? That experiencing something difficult taught me how research can transform problems into solutions. That watching you turn Uncle Marcus and Uncle David's betrayal into a foundation that helps other families showed me that the most important discoveries come from refusing to let bad things be the end of the story. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing applications for the newest foundation program, support services for healthcare workers facing false professional accusations, modeled after my own experience with pharmaceutical theft allegations that had destroyed my nursing career. The applications were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Nurses accused of medication errors they hadn't committed, doctors facing malpractice claims based on fabricated evidence, healthcare workers whose careers had been destroyed by institutional politics and professional jealousy. Each application represented someone whose life had been derailed by the same kind of systematic fraud that my brothers had used against me. But now, instead of facing these challenges alone, they would have access to legal representation, financial support, and advocacy services funded by the money that had been stolen from my family. My phone rang, Jonathan Hayes calling with news about the Foundation's latest initiative. Sarah, the nursing scholarship program has received applications from over 3,000 candidates this year. We're funding full tuition and living expenses for 200 nursing students who are committed to working in underserved communities after graduation. 200 future nurses who understand that healthcare is about service rather than profit. Exactly. And Sarah, there's something else. Harvard Medical School wants to establish the Sarah Mitchell Chair in Medical Ethics, funded by an endowment that would support research into preventing professional fraud and protecting healthcare workers from false accusations. I thought about the path that had led from sleeping in a car with a sick child to having an endowed chair at Harvard Medical School named in my honor. Jonathan, 5 years ago, I was a homeless former nurse with a revoked license. Now Harvard wants to create an endowed chair focused on the ethical issues that destroyed my career. 5 years ago, you were someone who'd been victimized by professional fraud. Now you're someone who's transformed that experience into institutional change that will protect other healthcare workers from similar victimization. After Jonathan and I finished discussing the Harvard endowment, I walked through the penthouse that had become our home, looking at photos that chronicled Tommy's transformation from a sick child to a healthy teenager preparing for university. Pictures from medical center dedications and nursing scholarship ceremonies, images that documented how suffering had been transformed into service. In his room, Tommy was video chatting with other teenagers who'd participated in clinical trials, comparing notes about how their medical experiences had influenced their academic interests and career goals. Mom, did you ever imagine when we were living in the car that Uncle Marcus and Uncle David's theft would end up helping so many people? Never. I thought their betrayal was just destruction, just loss, just proof that family loyalty didn't mean anything to people who valued money more than relationships. But it turned out to be the beginning of everything we built, instead of just the end of everything we lost. I looked at my son, marveling at the insight that had developed through surviving injustice and discovering that survival could be transformed into service for others facing similar struggles. Tommy, what do you think is the most important thing you learned from everything that happened to us? That bad things happening to you doesn't make you a victim forever. That good people sometimes face terrible situations that aren't their fault, but become their responsibility to transform. That the difference between tragedy and triumph isn't what happens to you. It's what you decide to build from whatever's left after the damage is done. I kissed my son goodnight and walked to the windows that had become my thinking space, looking down at the city where my life had been destroyed and rebuilt, where Tommy's medical needs had transformed from devastating limitation to valuable research contribution. Somewhere in a federal prison 5 years ago, Marcus had died knowing that his greatest crime had become the foundation for his sister's greatest contribution to healthcare access. Somewhere in a cemetery today, David rested knowing that his theft had ultimately funded medical care for thousands of children whose families faced the same impossible choices he'd forced us to make. And somewhere in our penthouse tonight, Tommy was preparing for a university career built on research that had grown from his own medical challenges, proving that suffering could be transformed into service when approached with courage, wisdom, and resources sufficient to turn personal experience into institutional change. I discovered that the venganza más dulce wasn't destroying the people who betrayed me. It was building something so meaningful from their betrayal that their crimes became the foundation for extraordinary service to others. Some inheritances arrive as money. Others arrive as opportunities to transform injustice into advocacy, suffering into service, and personal healing into institutional change that outlasts everyone involved. The most valuable thing Robert Wellington left me wasn't $8 billion. It was the power to ensure that my brother's worst choices became the foundation for my family's greatest contributions. The end.
You know, before I end this video, I want to talk to you for a moment. Not as a narrator, not as someone telling a story, but just as someone sitting across from you, reflecting on what we just experienced together. Because stories like this, they don't just come and go, they stay. They linger in your mind, in your chest, in that quiet space where you start asking yourself questions you didn't expect. I remember the first time I came across a story like this. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies are. There were no grand speeches, No perfect endings, just the woman facing things that felt impossibly heavy, and yet somehow she kept going. Not because she had all the answers, not because she wasn't afraid, but because something inside her refused to give up. And I think that's what makes stories like the one you just watched so powerful. It's not about perfection. It's not about always winning. It's about endurance. It's about what happens when the world tries to defy you, limit you, silence you, and you still choose to stand. Even if your voice shakes, even if your steps are slow. The women in these stories, they're not just characters. They represent something real, something that has existed for generations, strength that has been passed down, even though pain, courage that show off, even when it feels like there's nothing left. And if you really think about it, how many times has that kind of strength gone unnoticed? How many stories were never told? How many voices were never heard? That's why this channel exists, to create a space where those stories are not just told but felt, where every moment of struggle matters, where every act of courage, no matter how small, is seen, and where rising again and again becomes something worth honoring. Maybe there was a moment in this story that hit you a little differently. Maybe it reminded you of someone you know. Maybe it reminded you of yourself. And if it did, I hope you hold on to that. Because strength doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like surviving one more day. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like starting over when everything in you is tired. But it's still strength, and it still matters. So as you leave this video, don't just move on to the next thing right away. Sit with this for a second. Think about the journeys you just witnessed. Think about what it represents. And most importantly, remember that every story like this is the reminder of something powerful. That no matter how many times someone is pushed down, no matter how many systems try to break them, there is always the possibility of rising again. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to stay with us on this journey, because there are so many more stories waiting. Stories that will challenge you, move you, and maybe even change the way you see the world just a little bit. Thank you for being here with me, truly. And until the next story, take care of yourself, keep your heart open, and never forget how powerful it is to rise, even when it's hard. Bye.